we have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. Probably the hot topic of the last month or so, certainly in global finance, but perhaps even macroeconomically as well, has been the question about whether we're in the mother of all bubbles, the AI bubble, the superintelligence bubble. Is it a bubble? Isn't it? Is it going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread? Is it going to be another pets.com? Is there going to be a government bailout? Is there not going to be a government bailout? Is OpenAI already angling for one? Has David Sachs put the kibosh on it? Well, we're not going to answer that question tonight. My own view is this, that there is a bubble, but it is a bubble that will not be allowed to pop. Okay? I'm saying right now that the US government will not allow the AI bubble to pop. There are three main reasons for this, and I think each of them individually could perhaps prompt the government, the current presidential administration, to step in and prop up or backstop at least the market, if not outright bail these guys out. But I think in combination, they're going to lead to further US government involvement. So what are these three things? I'm going to start from the least important and work up. Okay, least important is companies like OpenAI have become extremely good at intertwining themselves with other companies. Okay, so do you remember in the 2007 financial crisis, a lot of the banks were called too big to fail. A lot of the organizations that were bailed out were called too big to fail. But I think another way of looking at it is that they were too interconnected to fail. So for instance, the bailout of the insurance and I believe reinsurance company AIG was related to the fact it was interconnected with so many banks and it had contracts owed to so many banks, and if it had gone down, that would have had a knock-on effect on the balance sheets of those banks, and then they would have been in all kinds of trouble too. And therefore AIG needed to be bailed out as a kind of a proxy bailout to the broader American banking sector. I think that if you look at what's been happening recently, some of the deals that look incredibly like circular financing in nature, they can be seen as a means of interconnecting companies like OpenAI with the entire sector, with other big names like NVIDIA and Oracle and Intel, for example. So if OpenAI went pop, where would that leave NVIDIA in terms of its orders for the next 3 to 5 years? Where would that leave Oracle? Where would that leave Intel? Okay, it could be that some of these big AI companies going down the Swanee could, in the end, lead to other big names like NVIDIA, like Oracle, like Intel, like AMD. You guys can name even more than that, really struggling as well. The second reason is that if the AI bubble pops, then you can bet that other tech company stocks will also take a big hit. Now, companies like Google get a huge proportion of their revenues from advertising, like advertising on search. They have a massive and consistent stream of revenues from search. And because of that, they can probably weather big hits like this. They can probably see massive amounts of capital at risk that they've deployed or that they've put at risk being wiped out. Probably the same for Meta, probably the same for Amazon, because it gets so much from its data centers and its servers and all the rest of it. But there's no doubt that it would take a hit. And you have to remember that these companies are central to stock market valuations. We've been hearing for about 3-4 years now that the so-called FANGs or the Magnificent Seven, or however you want to talk about them, companies like Google, Meta, Microsoft, Apple, Netflix, they all comprise a group that constitutes a huge concentration of stock market value in the US. So if they take a hit, the whole stock market takes a big hit. That starts wiping out a lot of capital. That starts causing margin calls. That wipes out loads of people who have got a lot of money invested in ETFs. That wipes out people who have taken leverage out, and you get a self-fulfilling cycle. So if something hits the tech sector, it could very rapidly ripple out the whole sector, the broader financial sector, I should say. Don't forget also that the crypto trade is very heavily linked. It very heavily mirrors the tech stock trade as well. So if tech stocks go down, crypto usually goes down in lockstep. If tech stocks go up, the same thing happens. Crypto often goes up. So a lot of people that are buying crypto and putting their wealth in crypto, they're also going to be wiped out. So you're going to have a lot of losers. Does the present US presidential administration want so many people to lose? I know Donald Trump has said no crying at the casino, but when so many people start crying at the casino, when the stock market starts tumbling and it gets really scary, when you start worrying that the banking sector might be drawn in, big hedge funds that you're pally-pally with might get dragged in and see all their capital wiped out, when all of this starts happening and the wailing happens and the middle-class people whose pensions rely on the S&P 500 start seeing their pensions completely disappear, then it becomes a completely different matter. Then you start pressuring the Federal Reserve to step in and start buying assets, essentially redoing the Greenspan put all over again. Then you start seeing the federal government acting as buyer of last resort. Then it really starts happening. But notwithstanding points 1 and 2 about interconnectedness and the fact that the stock market is so concentrated on tech stocks, the big issue is that this is now a strategic matter. Okay? Now, you want to do a little bit of history on this. You need to go back to the end of the Obama administration when a person called Eric Schmidt, who is incredibly well known in the tech sector, he is perhaps the biggest figure, the most important figure in the US tech sector. He was CEO of Google for about a decade, and then he was chairman of Google and the parent group Alphabet for a long time, and an advisor to Google. He also sat on the board of directors at Apple as well. He is tremendously well connected in the US political scene. He's a bit like the tech sector's equivalent of Jamie Dimon in the banking sector, okay? But perhaps even more important than that. Now, he chaired the presidential board of advisors on technology, and he was also an advisor to the Pentagon as well. And he led the way in pushing the idea that what was going to cement America's economic and military dominance for the next, for the strategic time horizon, which, you're looking at decades, not years, okay? So for the next 50 years or whatever, was going to be really focusing on cutting edge technologies like AI and like machine learning and like big data and all of these kind of things, and integrating them into the economy and integrating them into defense and, defense manufacture, and also the process of war fighting itself. And by doing that and doing it first, the US would gain an advantage that basically couldn't be taken over, because especially if the US got to AGI first, artificial general intelligence first, and what that would mean is the AGIs could build more AGIs, which in turn could build more powerful AGIs, which then could build more powerful AGIs, and so on. And although China might get there 6 months later, right, they would always be behind by that 6 months, because it would be it would be the singularity. It would go exponential, and you can never quite catch up an exponential curve in that way. It would be like, for you motorheads out there, it would be like the US having a V12 that was humming on all cylinders, and the Chinese had a V8 that was turbocharged so that at top speed it could reach the same speed as the V12, but you always had that period of turbo lag in the lower revs until it could get up to that speed, right? Like that's what it would be. That was the big idea. And in the last 5 years, in the last 4 years, you've seen that idea become increasingly central to the story of US future prosperity. You've seen that idea become basically what America is relying on. Now, on one side, you hear people like Elon Musk making that argument, but from a kind of a doomsterish perspective, he's saying the only way that we can save ourselves from bankruptcy is achieving this. But then you also have the kind of like what Philip, my super co-host here, often calls Turbo America. These guys who say like, look, okay, the Chinese are catching us up and in fact even overtaking us in many areas. But what we're going to do is we're going to do the high-end stuff. And then when China starts overtaking America on the high-end stuff as well, these guys say, yeah, okay, that doesn't matter because we're just ahead on AI. We're ahead on machine learning. And if we get there first, the prize is going to be so big and it's going to be so difficult to bridge the gap once we've got there that China overtaking in all these areas doesn't really matter at all. So it's become kind of central, like the prize is so big. I want to give you a few examples. I mean, obviously I've explained the AGI idea, but maybe you think to yourself, well, I don't think we're going to be able to get to AGI. I don't think AGI is going to be a thing, or if it is a thing, it's not going to be for a long time yet. Like takeoff is not going to happen anytime soon. But if you can start integrating AI into, say, your warfighting capabilities, if you're, say, a ship and a barrage of missiles comes from over the horizon, you might be able to use AI to figure out, based on past known positions of opposition assets and the direction from which these missiles are traveling and the known characteristics of the individual missiles that are going toward you, the locations that you can strike at for a counter barrage, for example. Or you might be able to use AI as a means of collating the immense amount of intelligence that comes to a military commander from satellites, from reconnaissance aircraft, from drones, from people on the ground, from electronic intelligence, from all of these things need to be collated these days. And because there are so many platforms with drones and small individual units and first-person drones and unmanned aerial vehicles and unmanned ground vehicles and reconnaissance, because all this stuff comes in, there's an immense amount of information, whether it be video, whether it be radar, whether it be electronic in nature and looking at the electromagnetic spectrum that's coming in. And you might be able to use AI to collate that incredibly quick and hook it up with big data algorithms and big data analysis to provide usable information to a commander much faster than the opposition commander can get his usable information, and by doing that gain a qualitative and quantitative advantage on the battlefield. These things as a prize, I mean, again, you might not think that you can get there, but these things as a prize are so tantalizing. And that's before we get into the economic advantages of AI. So it's become a strategic issue for the US. It's become a strategic matter. And I think that when push comes to shove, even the free marketeers, even the people like David Sachs who have already come out and said there'll be no bailout, there'll be none whatsoever. When push comes to shove, when the terror of the Chinese getting ahead on AI and claiming this prize, and it being the Chinese who get there first and get this unassailable gap that no matter how fast America runs, the Chinese will be running just as fast, like the old Alice in Wonderland story of the Red Queen. Okay, when that happens, at the same time that the stock market is tumbling and it starts to look really scary in terms of all of the capital that's being destroyed and therefore all of the leverage that's being destroyed and the effect that has on the broader economy, and middle-class boomers are screaming because their pensions are being destroyed and the hedge funds are screaming because they're going under and they have incredible lobbying power. And OpenAI is connected with so many companies that are in turn going to be facing a lot of trouble. At that stage, the US government will step in with the big clunking fist of the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury, and the AI bubble will not be allowed to pop.
Well, you say it's a strategic sector. I'd say it's a strategic sales pitch, actually. I think that's what's actually going on here. The sales pitch is speculative. It's completely speculative. Almost everything about AI is speculative, apart from the pretty cool search engines that we've got, which are pretty much what it produces. And, you can tailor that in a manufacturing direction or in a computer programming direction or whatever. And it's pretty impressive technology. More impressive than Google search? I mean, it's better than Google search, but I'm saying like more impressive than presenting the first person using Google search. Not so much. More impressive than the internet? No, don't tell me that. More impressive than personal computing itself? No. So my kind of like impressedness level with AI is like low to mid. But, I could be wrong about that, and maybe it solves like every military problem under the sun. But the real issue is what you've laid out more broadly, which is the enormous buy-in from like not just multiple stakeholders, but all stakeholders. I mean, not literally all, but like it seems like everyone's got an extremely large stake in AI. And that seems to me to make it somewhat different from the tech boom of the late 90s and early 2000s, which it's often compared to. And in many other ways, it is very similar to the tech boom. But the tech boom, if you kind of vaguely remember that time, like everyone was gambling on the market, but they didn't see the market as existential. I mean, the people in the tech sector sort of saw it as existential. At least the ones that were taking advantage and didn't have good companies. But, all the kind of business people were like, either kind of interested in it or invested in it. What I mean to say is that there was other stuff going on apart from the tech bubble. And that probably accounts for the fact that when the tech bubble went down, the US fell into a very mild recession. To this day, it's actually debated whether it was a recession or not. I don't have a very strong view on it, but it was definitely the mildest recession that the US has seen in many years. I'd add to that the Trump administration in its short life, we're in November, they've been in since January, has already shown a proclivity toward bailouts. And I'm talking, of course, of Argentina, because we did a show on the Argentinian bailout when it happened, and we kind of did a victory lap because we kind of predicted a lot of this stuff would happen. But since then, it's become clear to me at least that the bailout for Argentina was primarily to bail out American US dollar bondholders. It was a Wall Street bailout. A bunch of people bought Malay's debt based on the story of Malay. And when it started to go under, they went to the Treasury and asked for a bailout. And that bailout's just run through Malay. Now, I don't know this for a fact, but watching the American posture change in Latin America and watching Malay especially start to make comments about retaking the Falklands and all this kind of thing, my guess is that the Treasury or the Fed or whoever had to justified this at least partly on a strategic basis. Just like with AI, just because it's justified on a strategic basis does not make it a good strategic argument. The strategic argument was probably terrible, as I think it is with AI. But it was a strategic argument, and I think that's how this thing was sold. So you've got an enormous amount of stakeholders, as you've laid out, and you've got a proclivity toward bailouts, which I think there's a very strong possibility have already been justified by this like neo-Cold War strategic mindset, which is mainly delusional. In the Cold War, the US government didn't think like this. It's some fabrication that, was first come up with in geostrategy circles and has quickly left geostrategy circles and gone into the lobbyist. The grift tent, and it's being used there now. It's become clear that that's what's going on. So I guess you'd expect me to then draw the logical conclusion and say, Andrew, you're completely right. They're going to bail out the AI sector. We can also add to that the fact that I think Sam Altman of OpenAI made some comments that sounded very much so like he wanted a bailout and that OpenAI should be considered strategic. And then afterwards, he immediately walked it back and said, I absolutely did not mean that. Which means in corporate speak, he absolutely did mean that. So all this evidence points in that direction. So, does that mean that the bailout's coming? I'm not saying it's not. It might. Anything could happen. The past few years in America have been exceptionally strange in terms of both politics and policy. Not just the Trump administration, it's the Biden administration too. There's been a lot of unusual things happening, which suggests to me that the unusualness is not just coming from the Oval Office or from the White House. I think the unusualness has crept into the sinews of power in DC, and I think it's probably a reflection of the decline that's taking place there, the geopolitical decline and the confusion that it's creating. It's making people do things that they never would have done before. But here's the problem. I just don't know what a bailout would look like. So I was thinking about this when you suggested, Andrew, that we do this for the show. And I recalled that when I was working in finance, the Bank of Japan undertook a very controversial program, which was to buy up exchange-traded funds, index funds, basically the stock market. They bought Nikkei. I mean, they didn't buy individual stocks in Nikkei, but they bought Nikkei. And this was seen as kind of QE on steroids. QE, for listeners who aren't familiar, is buying up enormous amounts of government bonds. Now, that's quite normal because, government bonds are bought up by central banks as part of monetary policy, and QE is just doing monetary policy on steroids. Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? We won't comment on that, but it's not completely outside of the remit of central banks. Central banks are not supposed to touch the equity market. Central banks just aren't made for that. And so the Bank of Japan, I recalled, went in and bought up these ETFs. Now, it did so, I'm not really sure why, to be honest. I don't think it was trying to bail out the Nikkei or anything like that. I think it had just run out of ideas for how to get the economy to inflate, so it tried this as a last gasp. So I thought, I haven't checked in a while. Has the Bank of Japan gone even further in that direction and started buying out individual stocks? So I checked, and basically the story is this: yes and no. The Bank of Japan has bought some individual stocks, i.e. not index funds, but it's done so to bail out banks. A couple of banks, I think there were two of them, had equities on their balance sheet, and they needed a bailout, and the easiest way to get the bailout done was to relieve them of their equities, probably at a very nice valuation. That's not a bailout of the underlying companies on the equities. That's a bailout of the banks. And apart from that, the Bank of Japan, which is the most experimental central bank in the world, has never, as far as I can tell, bought equities in order to bail out a company. So, what does that mean? It means it's never been tried. And I'm not really clear what it would look like. Okay, so take a step back. Let's say the scenario you highlighted more at the beginning of your comments takes place. The markets start to crash. They might already be starting to crash because today I noticed that the AI index is down 2%. And coincidentally, at the beginning of market opening, Twitter started to not work, which seems to happen every time there's a threat of a tech bubble crash.
I should tell people that we're recording this on the 18th of November. So if between the time that we record this and it goes live, the S&P 500 is down 30%, then, you understand what's happening.
Yeah, and it might reverse. Look, this has happened a couple of times before. I'm only highlighting it because I think it's very funny that Twitter goes down every time there's rumors that the market might crash. You can draw your own inferences from that. But let's say it happens. Let's say the market starts to go down. And let's say like Nvidia's stock goes into free fall, or OpenAI stock goes into free fall. What happens next? Okay, well, I guess the Federal Reserve has two options that I can think of off the top of my head. One of them is to try and start buying up the NASDAQ as a whole, just trying to buy up the whole market. That would have precedent, obviously, in the Bank of Japan, which has bought up index funds before, ETFs. But I mean, how much money would they have to pour in to prop that up? I mean, when a market crash starts to happen, like entire segments of the market starts to liquidate. And it just seems to me that they'd have to buy up so much equity, they'd become like a huge stakeholder in the entire NASDAQ. And then what would they do with the stock? Take the dividends? Would they put people on the boards to vote? I mean, it's kind of unimaginable in a sense. How would it be held? What index fund would it be bought through? So that, when I think it through, is like a non-starter. And to be honest, although there might be a bit of a Greenspan put angle, you must remember the Greenspan put worked until it didn't. That's why we got the 99-2000 crash. Central banks can only do so much, unless, of course, they did something lunatic like I'm talking about now. The other option is that they buy the individual stocks. So I guess what that would look like would be to go in and buy up a significant share in Nvidia, for example. Now, Nvidia, as far as I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's the world's first $1 trillion company. So Nvidia makes up like a significant percentage of the NASDAQ. I don't know exactly what it is, I haven't checked, but it must be 15%, maybe 20%. So even then, buying up a significant stake in Nvidia will be buying up a significant stake of the NASDAQ. That's how much of a bubble we're in, people. Just take note. That's crazy to me. Now, it makes a little bit more sense, I guess, because then, like, the Fed would only have to sit on the board of Nvidia or something, or, you know, a couple of other companies, you know, OpenAI or, you know, the other quote-unquote strategically important ones. But it would be highly unusual. And let's say that they did it, and the Fed figured out some way to put people on that board, and then it took dividends from the firm, and I guess put them on the Fed balance sheet, and then at the end of the year, turn them over to the Treasury, because that's how it works. Like, what next? You haven't sorted out the underlying problems with NVIDIA's business model. The crash isn't coming because, like, somebody jumped out with a ghost outfit on from behind a door and said, boo. Like, the crash inevitably comes because the underlying companies are junk. That's how these type of stock market crashes happen. It's different in 2008 when the entire financial system melts down. And by the way, I totally agree with you. If this crashes, I think the entire financial system will melt down in a way that it didn't in 99-2000 for reasons that you've highlighted. I would also add in private equity and private credit. Watch that space. And possibly the housing market, by the way, which could be in a bubble as well. But the thing is, like, what exactly would you do with that company? You know, so like in 2008, in theory, right, if you bailed out one company that was having a hard time in the stock market, and it was having a hard time just because valuations on the stock came down, but ultimately what drove the whole thing was the housing market collapsed, Lehman Brothers went under, blah, 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 and it really had nothing to do with, say, Google, right? Then you can kind of sit on the board, you can wait until Google gets back on its feet, and then you can exit the equity position. Highly unusual, not advising central banks to do this, but I can conceive of it. If you buy the stake in Nvidia, you haven't solved Nvidia's business model. Nvidia collapses, and this whole sector collapses because it's completely built on nonsense. It's built on people selling chips to each other in the hope that, like, the AI singularity occurs and we get Skynet. Like, that's as far as I can tell the pitch. And I'm not the only one saying it now. You can read about this in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, which are saying, like, is this just all these people passing a hot potato to one another? So what do they do with the business model? My point is that if the Fed did this, or the Treasury, I guess, could do it too, but it would probably be the Fed. If the Fed did this, it would be stuck with an equity stake in a company that not just would be a speculative investment. I mean, everything's really a speculative investment. But it will be a consensus investment that most people think, as they're showing with the selling off of these stocks, is not going to generate the returns and the business model that it's promising. And then what is it? They just have this zombie firm, which makes up like 15 or 20% of the entire stock market, and the largest shareholder is the Federal Reserve. And they send a guy down to sit on the board as the company just rots from the inside. Do they bail it out again? You know, if it starts to go under, do they throw good money after bad? Do they just keep propping this zombie up? I mean, this is like nothing else. We've heard of kind of zombie banks in Japan and stuff like that. But banks are a different business model. You can make a case for having a banking structure that's working for 10 years doing banking and making losses. That is not impossible to defend. You can actually defend that. We're talking about capitalist firms that are supposed to produce products. So when I think it through, I'm just like, whoa, that's super crazy. I'm not saying it can't happen though, because the political economy forces that you laid out, I think, are completely correct.
Well, look, I think we've long disagreed, the two of us, Philip, about the potential utility of AI. I mean, you think it's not that cool. I think the potential is incredible. I mean, I remember when AlphaFold solved the protein folding problem, and that helped with the development of the COVID vaccines. But that problem, that ability to take the kind of two-dimensional string of molecules and understand how they will create a final 3D shape, and to be able to do that like massively faster than it's possible for humans to do in the laboratory, and thereby help with things like new drug discovery and development of novel vaccines and general innovation in pharma and biotech, I think is incredible. And that kind of ability is potentially replicable across a whole range of areas, such as engineering and manufacturing, where the whole process of product design can be absolutely cut because AI is so much better at the process of simulation and design, material science. And then you can look at even things like weather forecasting could be revolutionized by artificial intelligence. And I mean, weather forecasting might not seem like a big deal. You watch the weather forecast on the BBC and you think that might be wrong or whatever. But, to farmers, to shipping, to defense, to sports, to even some industries, electricity generation, especially as Britain shifts toward more renewable energy. The application to AI just to a small area like weather forecasting could have phenomenal upside in terms of productivity gains in a whole range of sectors. And then you get to things like logistics and the ability of AI to optimize, logistics chains and, like these intricate, incredibly long, thin global supply chains and just-in-time logistics, and to be able to predict disruptions and optimize routes and, manage inventory more efficient, like all of those things. And I'm, just thinking of things off the top of my head at the moment, could really see massive lifts in productivity from AI, and the potential for that, even if it is just sales, is so tempting that it would be difficult to imagine China winning that race for a country like the US, which wants to stay in the economic lead, if indeed it still can be said to hold the lead. But on your question about the bailouts, Philip, could it not take the following form? Could they not look and say, well, hang on a second, the majority of the capital being spent here, the fact that they've got these like $1 trillion funding needs over the next few years based on billion or tens of $billion revenue is because of the build out of data centers and the purchase of chips. So rather than actually taking control of these companies, could we actually start building some of the data centers and taking 100% equity stakes in the data centers, in the same way that a government might own or partially own a railway system or an electricity grid system, or even in some countries, mobile phone towers, okay? And then we'll actually rent that out to companies at maybe something like a market rate. But we'll use the big balance sheet of the state or the big balance sheet of the central bank to take equity stakes in these. And over a period of time, we'll hope to get a return on that equity. But that would then bail out the companies. And then the companies can sink and swim based on the strength of their models, based on the industrial utility of what they're doing. I mean, could that not be a route where a bailout would be more feasible? And by doing that, it would kind of put a floor under the market and give the market confidence that, okay, this is going to work out and we're not going to see all this capital wiped out. Would that not be an answer?
Yeah, but the question is, if the data centers are needed, they're speculative investments. So, like, if a government wants to take a stake in an electricity company, the demand for that electricity, presumably they want to, like, electrify an area. You know the demand. I mean, you basically know the demand. Maybe you know it like plus minus 10%. The whole question around AI is, how many of these chips do we need? Will they become more efficient? Is DeepSeek just the beginning of the efficiency gains? Will we need all these data centers, etc., etc., etc.? And the market right now is saying, we need loads, we need like maximum, infinity, print the data centers, print the chips. And it's probably not true, and people are waking up to the fact that it's not true. So if the US came in and bailed them out through creating data centers, and the whole thing falls apart, like what do they do with, I don't know, $200 billion worth of data centers in LLCs or LTDs or whatever with a board, and sitting on the board are like a bunch of guys from the Fed and the Treasury? It's the same problem. It's okay, fine, that's a little bit less weird than being on the board of Nvidia with a partial stake, but you've still got this like dud investment. Like, what do you do with it? Then you just you dispose of it? And what in the end have you done? You've just propped up faith in the market, I don't know, for what? 6 months? 12 months? 18 months? Like, eventually the Wile E. Coyote runs off the cliff and looks down, Eventually people say, well, we didn't need the data centers. So in that instance, what you're paying is simply to kick the can down the road, unless you're right about the data centers being needed. But if you're right about this data centers being needed, the private sector will build them, and there shouldn't be a problem in the first place.
EuthanisedUK.
Multipolarity related scandal this week. Breaking news in Britain. Things are really, really rough in the demographics of the country. Really grim stuff going on. And it was discovered, apparently, by me. I don't think I'm the first one to discover it, but apparently I'm the only one to publicise it. These are the recent British abortion statistics, and they are really, really, really grim. I want to preface this with something, because something very disturbing is going on in UK politics. Something very disturbing is going on in the UK, first of all, but we'll get to that in a moment. But something really disturbing is going on in British politics. Over the summer, I think it was in June, the British Parliament voted to legalise late-term abortion. Now, think about that whatever you want, but apparently an insufficient public debate took place around this issue that nobody knew what the abortion rate was. And I had to go on Twitter, not trying to get the swelly head, but I had to go on Twitter and post these figures for the entire country to have a political meltdown. That is really, really, really weird. How do you have a debate? And there was a debate, not a huge debate, but there was a debate over the late-term abortion issue. How do you have a debate like that and none of the media and none of the politicians point out that something funny is going on with the abortion statistics? Okay? So I'm just going to put that out because I think it's really germane to the conversation of how Britain is getting itself into these issues, and I'll come back to that. So the issue is this. Britain's always had a pretty high abortion rate. I don't think it's well known in the country. The country is very, very squeamish about discussing this issue. Far more squeamish than the United States, and even more squeamish than Ireland and most European countries. It was unusual when I moved to Britain how little people were willing to discuss this issue. But it's always had a pretty high rate, and I cannot tell you right now why that is. I do not know. I have not looked into it enough. But most other countries that haven't just introduced abortion, like Ireland's introduced abortion recently, and obviously so abortion rates go up and all, fine. But most other countries have seen their abortion rates stabilise or go down. Hungary has seen it go down significantly. I'm pretty sure the US has seen it go down pretty significantly too. The British abortion rate's been climbing for a number of years, probably about a decade, and it's been climbing about 10% a year. Lagged, it's a slow-moving variable, so 5-year lag on it. It's been growing about 10% on the 5-year mark, and that's a bit weird in and of itself. But then I looked at the statistics, and in 2022, the abortion rate in Britain increased 50%. 50% in 1 year. I mean, not really in 1 year, it was trailed, but it really increased in 2022. And the current forecast that I have seen that look pretty credible put it at 2024 up about 62%. That is not an increase, that is an enormous enormous increase. And what does that cash out as? 1 in 3 pregnancies in the United Kingdom are currently being aborted. That is an astonishing number. I think in America it's something like 1 in 10. I think. Maybe it's 1 in 8. But it's around that. 1 in 3 pregnancies in Britain are being aborted right now. And here's the thing. It's not just about the kind of, is that bad? Is it not bad? We don't really talk ethical policy or whatever on multipolarity. But the increase, this is the key, the increase in the abortion after 2022 is eating into the births. It's not that people are having, unprotected sex more, or they're getting pregnant more, and then that's necessitating more abortions. That would make no sense anyway, because of the rise of these permanent contraceptions, which are one of the main reasons that abortion is falling in most countries. And these are widely used in Britain because they're free, because the NHS gives them out. No, this is people who up until very recently were having children, and they're deciding not to have children. And that's where things get a bit creepy. So let me give some sense of that. Prior to this large increase, so we're talking about the 2010s, roughly the 2010s, you had about, call it 700,000 births a year. And you had about 120,000 abortions a year. And remember, that's high. That's high by global standards. But, not justifying it, not criticizing it, I'm not going to give my opinions on it, but that's 800,000 viable conceptions, 100,000 abortions, 700,000. Okay. Now, it is something like, if the projections are correct, 520,000 births and like 250 or 300,000 abortions. What that means is that the birth rate is falling. Babies, people that were having the children in, say, as late as 2018, 2019, are having abortions. So the question is why? And so I asked some of my friends in politics in Britain who actually are pretty anti-abortion, so I figured that they'd know. And they told me it was because of the liberalisation of the abortion law during COVID to allow people to get abortions in their own homes. And I said, I don't think that could account for a 60% increase. Because, what you're assuming there is basically there were a bunch of people who would have got abortions if it was easier, but they were kind of, I guess, too lazy or too embarrassed to go down to the clinic. Okay, I could buy like 10, 20% of people, not 60%. That makes no sense. So I investigated it, and it turns out it's nonsense. It's just complete nonsense. I won't go into the details. You can look on my Twitter account. There was a whole argument behind it. Trust me, it's not true. What's actually going on here is the huge hit to living standards that took place in Britain in 2022. The absolute shock to living standards. Everyone who lived there that year knows what I'm talking about. You can't see the extent of it in the statistics even today. It was an enormous hit to living standards. And that, I think, is what caused this. So just very quickly before I hand it over to you for some grimacing, is this just not a moral issue? Is this just a social issue? No, it's not just a social issue, because Britain already has massive demographic problems. The reason that there's so much migration in Britain, which is one of the key voting issues in Britain, it is literally destabilizing the country, and everyone knows that. Everyone knows what I mean by that, even if you're completely pro-migration. You know that if you're pro-migration, the guy sitting at the other end of the bar is fired up about it. It is highly divisive. The migration is mainly due to the fact that the country hasn't had an above replacement birth rate since 1971. It's a demographic issue, and the country's basically broke, and so they bring in migrants to work, and the migrants pay taxes, and yes, they get more benefits than they pay in taxes, but they add more to the GDP, and so it keeps the fiscal situation, which is already on a razor's edge, propped up. Well, now what happens if you're aborting an extra 15% of the children? Okay, well, guess what's going to happen to migration? Well, either the migration is going to go up, or you're going to hit the fiscal wall much, much quicker. And of course, add on to all this the fact Britain's already broke. We talk about it on the show all the time. There's fears that it might have to go to the IMF. I mean, it's on the brink. Rachel Reeves is putting together a budget right now. You should read the reporting on it. I'm sure a lot of people who listen to the show have. It's a disaster. So all of this is coming at once. And I'll just say very quickly on the response to it, to loop back into my comments on the fact that nobody knew about this. I did not get a bunch of anti-abortion people coming after me on Twitter and telling me that, you know, my body, my choice or anything like that. I got a bunch of absolutely shocked people, many of them saying I'm pro-choice, but I did not know these statistics. How did I not know these statistics? Nobody has told me this. That was the general response. Literally, on the right and the left, that was the general response. How have I not been told this? This is relevant information to me. How do I not know it about my country? All I can say is good question.
You know what's really strange about this, Philip, and what actually really freaks me out is if you look at one of the biggest socio-economic disasters of our lifetimes, we're just about old enough to have lived through this from afar, to be able to have viewed it vicariously, was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the descent of the constituent nations of the Soviet Union into, you know, an economic calamity that, you know, nobody who wasn't alive during the US Great Depression or in the US Midwest during the Dust Bowl can really comprehend. They've had no experience of something so bad. Famously, we see that in a collapse of the total fertility rates of those countries. You know, if you look at a country like Russia, you see this sudden collapse in the 1990s of the total fertility rate, and then a kind of plateauing, or maybe a continued slight decline, followed by a little increase after a little while. You know, a really good country to look at in terms of the effect of how things look for the nation on the total fertility rate is actually Ukraine. Because what we see in Ukraine is we see a kind of a plateau at or just above replacement from the 1960s, the 1950s, all the way to 1985. And then we get, you know, perestroika and glasnost, we get Chernobyl, we get the slow, unraveling of the Soviet Union where everyone goes crazy. Between 85 and 2000, those 15 years, total fertility plunges from replacement to about 1. Okay? So it plunges from about 2.1 to about 1 flat, or just above 1. And then from 2000, you start seeing this recovery. You start seeing a decline. And then the Maidan revolution hits, and you start seeing a decline back down again, because you get this economic break from Russia, which is obviously crucial for Ukraine's economy. You get this rumbling, ongoing kind of low-level civil war between central Ukraine and the Donbass, where the West is supporting one side and Russia is supporting the other side. And, you know, you get this sense that the country is again going down the wrong path. So we see that how people perceive the future direction of travel for a country affects the total fertility rate. You know, like from the 80s to 2000, you get this absolute collapse in total fertility in Ukraine. And then you start seeing hope return and a slow recovery of total fertility until it gets to about, 1.5, 1.4, somewhere around then. And then you get this another era of chaos and economic hardship hits, and you get a collapse, and then you get war, and you get a real plunge down to about 0.9, where it is today. Okay, it's kind of Korean levels. But you know what the really funny thing about that is, Philip? That's not how it seems to have worked with abortions. Abortions, since the end of the Soviet Union, have declined as a percentage of conceptions. They've declined in absolute raw numbers. They've declined through the catastrophe of the 90s. They've declined through that recovery. They've declined since the Maidan. It's the same with Russia if you look at their numbers as well. The abortion rate in those countries has consistently declined. I mean, I looked at the figures in a fairly cursory way just tonight, so maybe I'm mistaken when it comes to that. But maybe somebody who is more of an expert on abortion in Eastern Europe can correct me. Maybe somebody who understands the fertility, the fertility makeup of the former Soviet Union can delve deeper there and tell me how that's not representative, maybe. But it freaks me out when I see those numbers. And yet in Britain, things are so bad that people are just aborting children rather than have them. That should really frighten people, I think, because even during the collapse of the Soviet Union, even during the calamity of those times, abortions declined consistently and quite sharply, and yet in Britain they're going the other way. I mean, if it can't be explained through a sudden increase in the availability of abortion, maybe in terms of the scope or the means or whatever, which you suggest, and I believe you, and I think, because I think you make a good, strong argument, if it can't be explained by that, and we're going to say that it's explained by people's view of the future direction of the country, people's view of their own financial and economic security, people's sense of optimism, people's just desire to have babies, okay? People's view of what it's going to be like to bring a baby into this world, in quotation marks. Okay, if we're saying it's about that, then we're saying that that sense that people have in Britain, that sense of optimism, that sense of the future of the country and how bright or how bleak it might be, that sense of what it's like to bring a baby into this world, we're saying that that's worse than it was for people in Ukraine or Russia in like 1997. Is that right? Can that be right, really? Kind of scary.
Do you know what I think it is? It's that no matter how bad it got in Russia in the 1990s, people always thought, I think, that if they just got through it, they'd develop a prosperous capitalist society, which ended up being true. And, even in the depths of like the financial crisis in Russia in 1998, Russia got a much worse shake of the economic reforms than the other countries. And that was by choice, by the way. Someday we'll do an episode on that, maybe. Maybe have Jeffrey Sachs on to tell us about it because he saw it firsthand. But even in 98, when the whole thing was falling apart and it was in hyperinflation, the Russians could look over at Poland, they could look over at Hungary, they could look over at that region, the former Czechoslovakia, and they could see that it actually was getting better. That once you kind of bottom out, you'll come up. And I think even like in the depths of the Greek crisis, that was probably true too. Greece has never rebounded to its pre-crisis levels, but honestly, its living standards were too high probably pre-crisis. But it's stabilized and it's just back to being Greece. And it's kind of like low growth and, it's mainly a tourist economy with some shipping and everything like that. And life's kind of got back to normal in Greece. I think the actual issue here is that people in Britain don't really want to talk about it, but they're actually fairly convinced that they're not going to bounce back. And their leadership class is not doing anything to convince them otherwise. In fact, they seem to be actually communicating that the decline in living standards is going to be permanent. I strongly suspect that might be what's going on. Is the shine coming off Sheinbaum?
Multipolarity has been, I think, from what I've heard, my listening hasn't been 100% comprehensive, but it's fairly extensive indeed. And I think that Multipolarity, we here, Philip and I, are the only podcast in the geopolitical space that has been following the ongoing conflict between the United States of America and Mexico, its southern neighbor across the Rio Grande. And just this week, what have we seen? Well, a series of protests were planned across Mexican cities against the government or the administration of President Claudia Sheinbaum. And what happened? Well, they broke out into violence, and pretty serious violence. The worst, or at least from what I've seen, and perhaps the videos were concentrated from Mexico City, but the most serious were in Mexico City, where somewhere between 15 and 20,000 protesters turned very violent, stormed barricades outside the presidential palace, beat up policemen. I think about 150 people ended up injured, the official numbers, and of those, 100 were police officers and 40 of them required hospitalization or at least hospital treatment. So what's going on? I mean, there's talk on our beloved X, formerly Twitter, that this could be another US effort at colour revolution. Is that the case? Well, I think the jury's out on that, but I think it's possible that, yes, that is what's happening. At least they're being encouraged to go down that route. At least they're testing the waters. So what's happened? Well, the proximate cause of this, I mean, the protests had been announced, and they're trying to buy into these Gen X protests that went through, if you remember, Nepal and Morocco, and have been causing waves. That's the big selling point of these, is that the Gen X guys with their grievances against various governments who happen to be, quite randomly, I'm sure, not quite pro-Washington enough for Washington's taste. However, in Mexico, it was fairly obvious that it wasn't quite a Gen X protest. I mean, what is Gen X? People who are like, middle teenagers to 30 years old, but there was a lot of older people in the crowd as well. So what's happening here? Well, okay. First of all, I think we need to look at the US and Mexico and why they've had grievances. I'm going to summarize very briefly on this. Basically, there have been several layers of disputes between the United States and the previous administration, AMLO, of which Claudia Sheinbaum was the handpicked successor of President AMLO. And basically, they revolved around the fact that the Mexicans went a little bit pinko. They pursued kind of standard South American left-of-center policies. And that involved clipping the wings of the mining companies who previous administrations gave the sweetest environment for operating, and insisting that these mining companies took account of the environmental effect that they would have on communities near their mines, paying their miners a fair wage, paying taxes to the government, all of these things that big multinational corporations tend not to like doing. Well, the Mexicans started insisting on it. And a lot of these companies were Canadian and American multinationals, and they're both part of NAFTA, so they started, attacking the Mexican government based on that. They were also unhappy that the Mexican government wanted to protect Mexico against genetically modified crops, especially with a view to protecting certain legacy corn varieties. Corn and tortilla, it's a big thing in Mexico. It's part of the culture, and they wanted to protect these kind of historic and legacy corn varieties from perhaps cross-pollination with genetically modified crops. And the big agricultural companies of the US were saying, well, this goes against NAFTA agreements, we're going to take you to court. So there was that as well. And then there was also, the fact that, the Mexicans stayed neutral as their constitution demands of them in the Ukraine dispute. The Biden administration wanted them to come along, and anyway, there was a range of other issues. There was also efforts, because the Mexicans are so obese and unhealthy these days, there were efforts to clip the wings of companies like Coca-Cola and other big food producers, and again, that was very unpopular in the US. And finally, of course, you have the big one, which is the drug trade. And this really caused a lot of conflict between the US. You even had senior members of Congress demanding that the cartels be labeled as terrorists so that the US could take military action on Mexican soil, etc., etc. And this has caused, as we have been conveying on Multipolarity, once or twice a year, this has caused conflict between the US and Mexico. It really has. Relations have not been good. I should say here that I should give a shout out, because I get a lot of my information on this from a website called Naked Capitalism. And I try to occasionally give updates. And Naked Capitalism is pretty much the only place that I've found following this deterioration in relations and the reasons behind it in detail. Journalists called Nick Corbishley and one called Conor Gallagher have been on the beat of Mexico-American relations. So if you want to find more, you want to go to nakedcapitalism.com and type Mexico into their search bar, and you'll get a whole list of articles following this story if you really want to get the details. So what's happening now? Well, there's no direct evidence that the US is funding this, but a lot of the funding from the groups that were organizing the protests that turned violent seemed to come from the Atlas Network. And when I did a bit of research into the Atlas Network today, it seems to be a US-funded libertarian and nationalist website. So it's, like pro-corporation, pro-business environment. These are the people who are not going to like the Sheinbaum's kind of South American pinko government, okay? Then you also have this kind of Mexican oligarch called Salinas Pliego, who owns a whole range of interests, including TV channels, and has called for kind of a dirty war against Sheinbaum, and has recently been ordered by the Supreme Court to pay $3 billion, I believe, in back taxes in peso terms to the Mexican Treasury, which he's not happy about, obviously, and he generally disagrees with these kind of left-wing policies. And there have been a couple of others, like, opposition senators. But there's no direct evidence of US involvement. I haven't seen Mike Benz, drawing back the curtain and showing how the US is actually pushing this. But I think if the US wasn't at least tacitly encouraging this, I would be surprised. And I think the other point is that the Sheinbaum government is not so vulnerable to these kind of attacks. In fact, these left of center policies have been hugely, hugely popular in Mexico. AMLO had a massive approval rating. Sheinbaum, as his hand-picked successor, fully endorsed in the election, was elected on a landslide. Sheinbaum herself is still popular. She's got like a 70+% approval rate. So she's not that vulnerable. I think that the US, though, what they're trying to do is just cause problems. They're happy to cause problems. And what you get in a lot of situations like this, for British viewers, I want you to imagine the Brexit situation and then the post-Brexit situation. The Remainers, after they lost the election, very much looked to the European Union and very much looked to the Biden administration to give them a hand. Right? They kind of were crying out for help and they were quite happy for both the Biden administration and the European Union to interfere in British politics. Now, you might think that that's reasonable, that's fine. Biden administration, EU are trustworthy, they're allies, they're friends of the UK. The Remainers were looking to do what was best for the UK, and they were using every tool that they had at their disposal. But this is what happens. It's like opposition groups who lose. They look for more powerful outside agents to come in and help them. And, in the interest of balance here, we see that with the right in the UK. They were overjoyed that Trump got voted in. And then they looked to people like Trump and J.D. Vance to come and give them boost, to give them a motivational speech, to stick it to the establishment, to stick it to the lefties, right? And they look for help from American money and patronage networks, right? This is what happens, and I suspect this is what's happening in Mexico as well. You've got these political opposition figures, these kind of like angry oligarchs who have seen their business environment worsen and like are getting called to pay massive amounts of tax now. You've got these multinational corporations who aren't happy with the way things have shifted in Mexico and have become less favorable for them. And of course, they're linking up with perhaps networks in the US who are, because of the drug situation, because of the corporate disputes that they've had with Mexico, and in fact, recently the rule of law disputes as well, because of changes that Sheinbaum and AMLO have made to the judiciary. they're all linking up, and it might not be a concerted effort as yet, but you can be sure that the US will be happy to make life uncomfortable for Sheinbaum. It gives them leverage. It might even ultimately lead to the country spiraling out of control and they can put their person in there. It might give them cover to come in and try and attack some of the cartels, right? And ultimately, all these disgruntled actors can link up with US money, US help, US aid. Okay, I mean US aid as in aid from the US rather than the organization, and cause havoc. And I think that's what's happening in Mexico at the moment. And I think that we can expect it to continue because it's in America's interest to continue.
Is it, though? That's kind of the question. I don't know if anyone remembers the film Dumb and Dumber, where Jim Carrey's character's in a lift and he has like a big panic and just starts pressing all the buttons and like throwing his arms around and, you know, doing the Jim Carrey thing. Kind of feels like the Americans are doing that right now. So before the show, I fished around a bit and I found a Atlantic Council article. The Atlantic Council are of course an independent news organization tied to, I think, the government of India. No. Anyway, people can figure out what the Atlantic Council are themselves. The Atlantic Council published an article saying Gen Z, I think you were saying Gen X, by the way, Andrew, it's Gen Z. The Atlantic Council article said Gen Z protests, we should be saying Gen Z, but I suppose the Americans came up with the term, as you've alluded to. Gen Z protests have spread to 7 countries. That's an Atlantic Council article from about a week and a half ago. And it's kind of a humble brag style article in the style of the Atlantic Council. You look through the list. Apart from Mexico, they're like really poor countries. Obviously, you noted Nepal, that was the big one. There's the Ivory Coast. I'm not going to try and pronounce the French and embarrass myself. There's Madagascar. It's countries like this. It's like really poor countries that have probably very limited geostrategic significance. As was the case in Nepal, by the way. I mean, I think we covered it at the time. Limited geopolitical significance, tended to be pretty Western anyway, very strong ties to Britain. The Gurkhas come from there, the Gurkha military regiment. They march in, you see them marching around London sometimes. There didn't seem to be much point of it, and again, that looks like there doesn't seem to be much point to those kind of Ivory Coast and Madagascar ones. Mexico, as you say, does conceivably have a point, because there's tensions between the United States and Mexico, obviously. But as you also said, completely correctly, Sheinbaum's really popular. Like, I don't think they're going to overthrow the Sheinbaum government. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. So that's why I'm saying it resembles the kind of Dumb and Dumber scene where he kind of goes ape in an elevator and starts pressing all the buttons, right? Why is that bad for America? Well, multiple reasons. First of all, the color revolutions always had kind of a veneer of, how should I put it, peace, love, and understanding to them. They tended to be pretty non-violent, one or two accepted. And at the very least, the violence wasn't focused on. The peace, love, and understanding was focused on. And you kind of need to maintain those optics if you want the thing to keep working. The Gen Z protests are noticeable for their nihilistic violence, frankly. That's not really appealing to people. And so it'll strongly incentivize them to, first of all, not respond. Well, first of all, try and find ways to secure themselves against these, and I'll get to that in a moment. But also to crack down on them. Remember, like, the whole thing with the color revolution is the options of the ruling power are limited, because if they're too aggressive with the protesters, it'll generate more protesters. If the protesters are singing Kumbaya and putting flowers in the barrel of a gun, it really looks bad if you go in and like beat them really badly with police, or somebody gets shot, or that kind of thing. If you have a bunch of people like killing people and engage in nihilistic rioting, the vast majority of your population are going to be like, do whatever you need to do to put that down. And in fact, dealing with a riot of that sort might make you even more popular. This is kind of well known. And it's kind of how the color revolution thing operated, because it kind of dared the sitting power to go too far. Because if you go too far, you lose, in a way. So there's that. But then there's the other issue. There's the securing yourself against these things. So This goes back for me a very long time before I was that interested in any of this stuff, social media, color revolutions, any of this kind of stuff. I was a humble analyst at a finance firm, and I was asked to do an evaluation of Facebook's business model. This was years ago. This must have been 10 years ago nearly. And I said, okay, I'll do an evaluation of Facebook's business model. So I, broke it down by geography, type of user, everything like that. And when I broke it down by geography, much to my shock, and by the way, I'll defend myself, this stuff was not as widely known today as it was back then as it was today. The internet and so on has made things a lot more open. But to my shock, I found that some countries were closed to Facebook and they had their own platforms. Most notably Russia with VKontakte, and China with WeChat at the time. I think maybe it wasn't WeChat. I think they had some other program, Baidu or something. Anyway, Russia had VKontakte, and I said, that's interesting. That means there's ways of limiting market access to Facebook. Like, just logically, Facebook aren't allowed to operate there. That's why VKontakte works. So I go, diligent little me, and I go and I try and figure out why the Russians banned Facebook / promoted VKontakte. Not much on that in the Western press. It just kind of said the Russians are baddies and they should let Facebook in. And I was like, it's not really an answer. It's not really good for my stock analysis. And so I started, reading the Russian language stuff. And back 10 years ago, it wasn't that easy to translate, I can tell you. But I read it and I realized that they were just quite explicit about it. They said Facebook, we're worried about national security. We're worried that these things could be used to fuel protests. We've seen evidence of this elsewhere. Therefore, we're not allowing it in our country. And we're running our own social media platform, which is VKontakte. And I said, that's really interesting. I mean, that's a pretty low bar. Pretty much any country can do this. Not every country can build VKontakte. Okay, Russia's like a big country with decent programmers, actually, a fairly decent software development sector. I mean, they need it for their cyber attacks and cybersecurity, obviously. So I was like, okay, well, a lot of countries could do this. Like, pretty much any European country could do this. And other countries could shop around and go on other people's platforms. So, I argued, if you're like a smaller country like Mexico and you get sick of the Facebook model, you can pretty easily go and just adopt the VKontakte model and ban Facebook in your country. And a couple of countries did this. I think Iran at the time was on VKontakte, if I remember correctly. And I said, wow, that's a real glaring vulnerability in Facebook's business model. Because if there's any change in the wind, like mass change in the wind, like Facebook gets wiped out. I mean wiped out. Like decent percentages of its market will just disappear. And because the company's built up to manage a market this large, if you take out 30% of its market, sure, they could fire 30% of the staff, but companies that size don't work like that. That will be hard. And I think that's what's being risked here. It never happened. The doomsday scenario on that I said, massive geopolitical shift, collapse of Facebook's business model, never happened. But it still could. There's absolutely no reason that there's no way for that to happen. It's perfectly possible for that to happen. And in fact, we're at the point now, with AI, for example, where you could easily hire a development team of Chinese engineers with reasonably decent language skills and just come in and build a platform for your country. I'm pretty confident you could do that. These social media platforms are pretty old tech now. AI is the tip of the spear in tech, not developing social media platforms. That should be pretty trivial to do. Could a decent AI create a social media platform? I don't know, maybe. So they're running risks here. They're running the risks of not only discrediting the entire thing, which is pretty much discredited anyway. We've talked about the one in Georgia and how it's failed and, how this may be outdated political technology, but really discrediting it, really turning it just into crude rioting that makes the governments that deal with it more popular and only really works against the Ivory Coast and ultra poor countries with very little strategic value. And then on the other side of the ledger there, you could just push a bunch of countries to go I'm not using Facebook anymore. I'm not using those platforms anymore. And then where do they go? Knocking on the door in Moscow, knocking on the door in Beijing.
Well, I mean, worst case scenario, Philip, isn't just the loss of Mexico as a market for your social media companies. on the basis that these companies are used to foment revolutions. The worst case scenario is that in getting rid of the current government, in creating the conditions to get rid of the current government, and I have noticed that since we've shifted from colour revolution to these Gen Z revolution, we've become a lot more accepting that you will get this nihilistic violence associated. So, oh, well, these are young people, they're angry. Of course they're going to be violent, right? Of course they're going to be to respond violently. So I think, like, we have become, in the West, far more tolerant of a old-fashioned violent revolution than perhaps we were in the past. And in creating conditions where what you do is you see that you've got a really popular administration to go against. So first of all, you have to create conditions in which the country descends into increasing chaos and social instability, and protests are increasingly violent in urban centres. In creating those conditions in a country like Mexico, which has serious issues with organised crime and with drug cartels, the risk is that you don't end up putting in somebody like Lee Kuan Yew or Bukele, who can destroy the cartels and impose really business-friendly, libertarian economic policies and be very friendly to Washington and do what Washington says in terms of foreign policy. Like, the danger is that you don't get that person. The danger is actually that the country descends into violence and you get Libya on the other side of the Rio Grande, where chunks of the country are just run by cartels, right? In the same way that in Libya, chunks of the country are run by warlords and Islamist fanatics, okay? That's the danger. And do you really want, like, a massive version of Libya? Well, Libya is a huge country, of course, one of the biggest in Africa, but do you really want, like, Libya with the 15th largest GDP in the world on the other side of a river that is in some places wadable across to your country? I'm not sure you really do. And that's the risk that you're running.